All right, then, we left off with this page, which is your timeline showing colonial establishment in the New World. If you go to the next page, we pick up talking about what is happening back in Europe. So we've covered already your other monarchs, and in France, when it comes to the idea of Reformation and the situation in the country, things truly went from bad to worse. The French king died. He left 3 young sons to take over the throne, and these were very young people. The first son was a teenager when he came to the throne, and so because he was not old enough to truly rule the kingdom, he ruled with his mother, and his mother becomes really the power figure in France during this period. So her name is a name to know. She's from a very prominent family, and her name is Catherine de Medici. Medici. M-E-D-I-C-I. Catherine de Medici. The Medici family was prominent in Italy, and many of her family members, including herself, that were related to the Pope. So clearly they have a strong allegiance to the Catholic Church, and so this royal family will be very active in persecuting the Huguenots, in putting down all attempts at Reformation in France. That young teenage son will pass away shortly after coming to the throne. He becomes sick and dies. The second son was named Charles the Ninth. Charles the Ninth. In French, you need to see the spelling of his name so that you can understand something else in just a minute, but in French his name was Carolus the Ninth. Carolus. Now, believe it or not, this young man became king at age 10 when his teenage brother died. And so clearly his mother will be his regent. She will reign in his stead. While he wears the crown, she's making the decisions. He and his mom, that's what goes in that blank, wanted to completely eliminate the Huguenots, completely eradicate this Protestant presence in France. But eventually they had to compromise with them because the Huguenots had some very strong leadership even among the nobility in the country. And so they began to win many battles. In addition, the more that they persecuted the Huguenots, the more people became Protestant Huguenots. This often happens in Christian history or in the history of the church. One of the Huguenot leaders went to the royal family during a time when they had been winning battles, and so as part of the treaty, as part of the settlement for peace, this admiral went to the royal family and asked that France officially establish a colony in America. The purpose of this colony would be that Huguenots could leave France and go to this new colony, to this new world, and live and worship God in peace, no longer be persecuted. Well, this seemed like a win-win. This allowed the French to begin to colonize in the New World, and it would hopefully get some of these Protestants out of their hair. Well, recently, at this time, the Spanish king, Philip II, had announced that he had no intention of ever colonizing in Florida. They had made several attempts at exploration there that had ended in disaster. They recognized that there was no gold or silver or gems to be harvested from Florida. It was basically a swampy, hot, desolate place. And so they had really made a public statement in their courts that they had no intentions of colonizing in Florida. And so the French decided that they would establish a colony there. So King Charles IX and Mama Medici said yes. They approved and chartered this colony in North America. And so in 1564, the French Huguenots actually began a colony very close to Jacksonville, as you saw on your timeline with your map when we drew the line. In 1564, they established their colony. They named it after their king, their very young king. They named it Fort Caroline. We think of Caroline as a girl's name, but in fact this was Caroline named after Carolus IX, Fort Caroline, named after their king. This map just gives you a little view of where we're talking about, where this fort was located. So this is the coast of Florida. This would be north. So the top of the map is north. The mouth of the St. Johns River is here. They came inland just a little ways and they established their colony up on a bluff. Today it's called St. John's Bluff. So this is where Fort Caroline was located. St. Augustine will be founded in 1 year just south of Fort Caroline. And then Matanzas Inlet is also an important place to know on the map. We'll come back to this later. And just to give you an idea, again, this is where Daytona Beach is today. This is where Cape Canaveral is today. All right, we'll go on. You now have a page called the French Settlement at Fort Caroline. This is where you'll glue in one of your French maps, or the last of your French maps. So go ahead and do that, and we'll talk about the French settlement at Fort Caroline. 300 people on 3 ships made an 8-week voyage to Florida, landing in late June of 1564. So they're halfway through the year of 1564 when they land. The commander of this group was a man named René de Laudonnière. He was a dear friend of that Huguenot admiral who had negotiated the settlement, the French settlement here in the New World. The admiral's name was Admiral Coligny. So this is René de Laudonnière, who brought a group of 300 settlers to establish Fort Caroline. So who was on board? Well, primarily French Huguenots, including women and children. These were families that were coming to the New World. There were some French Catholics that were on board. There were some agnostics who resented any forced religious belief. So they just hated the fact, it's not that they believed something different or believed in the Protestant faith, but they didn't like the fact that the Catholic religion was being forced on them. And there were also with them some free blacks from Africa that came with them to Fort Caroline. What did they do when they got here? Well, we know because we have records. We have diaries from several of the folks that were here, several of the leaders that were here. We know that they were very faithful people, that they had regular, daily religious services, and a great missionary effort was made to reach out to the native peoples that they found there in the area of what today is the St. Johns River. They were very musical people, and this fits with what we know about them from France. They loved to sing hymns, they sang many songs, they brought with them many musical instruments on board the ship. We had fiddles, drums, trumpets, fifes. We know that these were, again, not a somber people, they were a joy-filled people. We know they played cards. They played other games. We know they made wine from local muscadine grapes that they found just growing wild here. They made maps. They drew the local animals and plants to send back to France as a record of what they had discovered. They explored. They looked for silver and gold. They wanted to be productive. They wanted to prosper here. They wanted to stay here and live and have their families and form a whole new society. And they multiplied. So they were fruitful and they multiplied. There were at least 8 children that were born in that first year that they were here. And we know that they planted very few crops. This was a downfall of the French settlement at Fort Caroline. And we'll see this repeated over and over again in many of the new settlements, that they just are not prepared to come and grow the food that they will need. So they plant few crops, and this is going to present a difficulty in the months to come. By the winter of 1564, they are actually in a starving time. 8 months later, they are at a point where they are just about to abandon the colony. And at that moment, a British admiral sails into the St. Johns River and approaches them. And in fact, they don't know at first when they see the ships coming in. They're very concerned that they're about to be attacked. But in fact, it's the British. and the British are friendly to the French at this time, and Sir John Hawkins appears. He actually provides them with food, but there's a providence of God that we see in the moment that he arrives. He's letting them know, you know what, the Spanish are aware of your presence here. We've been hearing the rumors that they're not happy that you're here. Still, the French families decide to stay. They trade some of the cannon that they have with them to John Hawkins for food and supplies, and we're going to see that that really is a poor decision on their part. Just a few weeks later, August 28th, so early August is when John Hawkins arrives and provides them with some supplies and gives them warning that the Spanish are aware that you're here. A few weeks later, they finally get the reinforcements that they have been waiting for. And it comes under the guidance of a French Huguenot captain, a very famous gentleman named John Ribaut. So his is a name to know. John Ribaut is a name to know. John Ribaut had been here before. I won't get into all the details, but there had been a trip before in 1562, and René Laudonnière and John Ribaut had come together in 1562. I'll tell you more about what happened to John Ribaut when we're there in St. Augustine. So John Ribaut is back now after a long absence, and he has with him 600 men, women, and children, primarily French Huguenots, but recognizing that the Spanish may not be happy that they're there, they have with them some soldiers, some men who are trained in military defense. If you'll flip the page, you can see that large map shows you some of the trips that were taken back and forth, but my real reason, you're welcome to study that map all that you'd like to. It does have lots of interesting information on it, but what I mostly want you to see is the location of La Caroline, the French fort, and then the location of San Agustin, the Spanish fort. Now the problem. Earlier in 1565, remember we're now in August of 1565, well earlier in the year, Mama Medici, afraid of the powerful Catholic King of Spain, and in fact she was trying to negotiate a deal with the powerful Catholic King of Spain, Philip II, actually told him, she disclosed that her own people were there. She sold them out and let him know that in fact, yes, they had established a French Huguenot settlement in the land that had been claimed for Spain. Do y'all remember who had claimed that land originally for Spain? His name was Ponce de Leon. So the land that originally had been claimed by Ponce de Leon, there were now competing claims for that land. And Spain did announce they didn't plan to colonize there. But by golly, King Philip II was not going to have, remember how devoted he is to preserving and advancing the Catholic faith, he is not going to have Protestantism taking root in land that had been claimed by Spain. And so, in 1565, he ordered one of his best generals, Pedro Menendez de Aviles, to rid Florida of the Protestants and establish a permanent colony there that would protect that land. So in 1565, that's the year that we mark the founding of St. Augustine. And you do not need to put that flag, you don't glue that flag down. There's no place for that. But that would be the flag that he came under. That's a battle flag of Spain. And so Pedro Menendez sailed under a battle flag because he was coming to eradicate the Protestant colonists at Fort Caroline. This is the official portrait of Pedro Menendez de Aviles. You'll see this when we're in St. Augustine, so I want you to become familiar with that image. Again, this map to give you an idea of where Fort Caroline was located and then where he will establish his base of operations in St. Augustine. This is the map that you have. I think one of the interesting pieces of information is it does show you the route of the Spanish treasure fleet as they hop into the Gulf Stream just south of Florida in the Florida Straits and come up the coast and back to Spain. This also shows you some of those other trips of René de Laudonnière and John Ribaut, and then here's Pedro Menendez coming in 1565. But again, if you guys will remember, that clockwise motion of our currents, it helps you understand, how it is that they're approaching the coast of Florida by riding those currents across the Atlantic Ocean and into Florida, or into the Caribbean. Meanwhile, back in France, Charles IX is king, and he's a young man growing into a teenager a child, 10 years old, growing into a teenager and now a young man. While he is king, even more Huguenots will die. There's a very famous and tragic event called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. On that day, in 1572, thousands of people were killed all over France. Literally, neighbor rose up against neighbor on that day, and they dragged people out into town squares and killed them. By the end of 1 week, 70,000 Huguenots across France were dead. The Pope celebrated by striking a coin to commemorate this occasion that he thought was a great victory for the Catholic faith. So again, I'm just telling you these things because I want you to get a picture of how pitched the conflict was between Protestant and Catholic, and how much the Protestants were willing to sacrifice in order to worship God in spirit and in truth. Charles IX died a tormented death just 15 months after the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and his last words, as he lay dying on his bed, he said, "What bloodshed, what murders," he cried to his nurse, "what evil counsel I have followed. Oh my God, forgive me, I am lost, I am lost." But whose counsel did he follow? Was he reading the Word of God for himself? Was he seeking out truth? No, he was not. He was following the counsel of his mother. And in this tragic case, his mother was not to be trusted. So therein ends the life of Charles IX. In the 1570s, Britain increasingly saw Spain as a great enemy. They watched what had happened during the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. King Philip II had been married to a British queen. Her name was Mary. Philip II had actually been the husband of Mary I, known as Bloody Mary. She was known as Bloody Mary because under her reign there was persecution of Protestants. There were some that were burned at the stake and others tortured and persecuted. So the British people were well aware of the threat of the violent spread of Catholicism. They saw Spain particularly as a great enemy. They watched as Spain crushed a Protestant revolt in the Netherlands, and they watched as Spain helped to coordinate and plan the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. This is when God provides a really interesting character in history, and his name is Sir Francis Drake. Sir Francis Drake, do y'all know what a drake is, by the way? A drake is a male duck, which does not sound very threatening. But in Spanish, he was called El Draco. El Draco. And in Spanish, El Draco was the dragon. The dragon. So it's, again, just an interesting providence of God, an interesting little twist in history that even his name, in his own language, wasn't a threat at all. But to those whom God had directed him to attack, essentially, his name becomes a watchword. His name means the dragon. God would really use this man, a privateer, he's a British privateer, as his instrument to cripple Spain. A privateer is basically a licensed pirate. But it's important for you to understand the character of Sir Francis Drake and his motivations. This man continuously attacked Spanish settlements and treasure fleets, or treasure ships. As a privateer, he shared that treasure with various investors, including the Queen of England, Elizabeth I. But where did he come from, and how was it that he saw this as really a righteous mission for him to be involved in? Well, image of Francis Drake. I know this isn't in your notes, but this was his official portrait, Sir Francis Drake. His dad had been a Protestant back during the time of Queen Elizabeth's sister. His dad had been persecuted under the reign of Bloody Mary. Francis Drake's father later actually became a pastor to sailors in the Royal Navy. They lived in a port city. They lived on an abandoned ship. He basically grew up on what we would call a houseboat today, but it was a ship. So he grew up living on a ship, living in a port, his father ministering to sailors in the Royal Navy. So this was his lifestyle. He was constantly around the sea and around ships. He became a really good sailor. And he recognized this huge threat that Spain presented to the Protestant faith. And he believed the best way to hurt powerful Spain was to cut off their money, to really strike them in their wallet. Especially after the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. But at any rate, he made a trip to Panama in 1572. I will show you on a map when we're there in St. Augustine. I'm not sure I have it here in my notes, so but I'll show you on a map. The Isthmus of Panama is where all of the treasure that was coming up from the west coast of South America had to be transported across that little tiny Isthmus of Panama in order to make it onto the treasure galleons that were headed back to Spain. So Francis Drake recognized that this was a real vulnerable place for the Spanish, and he actually went there. And let me just see if I have. No, I don't. Okay. I thought I had maybe a map in there. So he actually goes to Panama and is able to attack the mule train carrying all of that gold and silver and gems as it comes through the forests in Panama. Before the attack even took place, he received word of what had happened back in France, of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Those 70,000 people who died in 1 week for their faith. He was horrified and more determined than ever to strike at Spain. He successfully raided that overland mule train and he seized $5 million in gold, which he took back to England. That $5 million today would be worth billions. This was really the whole haul for one season of the west coast of South America. It was a huge portion of the Spanish treasure for that season. So this enraged Spain. Well, 14 years later, Drake, or as he was known, the Dragon, was still at work. And he's going to make a famous trip around, across the Atlantic, and he's going to strike at many Spanish colonies. He's still at work. One of his targets in 1586 was the Spanish colony of St. Augustine. He came here to St. Augustine and burned the town in 1586. He didn't get much treasure because there wasn't much treasure to be had in St. Augustine, but it was more a statement to the Spanish of English displeasure with their position, political position, and religious position. 80 years later, we had another British privateer who came and burned St. Augustine in 1668. I'll go back real quickly to this map. This map was drawn by folks that were with Francis Drake. So this is what the town looked like at the time. This is the Atlantic Ocean out here. Let me use my cursor and see if you can, there we go. Atlantic Ocean would be out here, and these would be Francis Drake's ships. This is the inlet. You'll see the inlet is still there today, coming into this river, the Matanzas River, and right here sits this fort, this wooden fort. And the wooden fort is what Francis Drake would have burned in 1586. Over here, you see the town of St. Augustine, so separated from the fort by quite a little distance. And then this landmass right here is called Anastasia Island. So Anastasia Island. They have to sail past Anastasia Island into the Matanzas River to attack this wooden fort right here. And then I mentioned, of course, 80 years later in 1668, another British privateer comes and burns St. Augustine. So finally, the Spanish decide to build a fort that can't burn. They allotted enough finances to build a fort out of a stone that they could actually find right there in St. Augustine. In fact, they were able to harvest it. Whoops. Sorry, y'all. Harvest it from Anastasia Island and just carry it across the river and build their fort. It's a very rare stone, and it's called coquina. Coquina. And I'm going to stop there and pick up with more information on the fort in just a moment.